Hey, everybody. Welcome to the official Do Good Better podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Kirby. Of course, we talked with people who can help our small and medium-sized nonprofit friends do good better. I can think of no better, pun intended, human being than a past guest, a second timer here on the official Do Good Better podcast. Scott Burlingame, he is the executive director of Independence Inc. up in Minot, North Dakota. We just spent literally 45 minutes talking before we even pushed the recording button. That's how fun we have talking about all things nerdy nonprofits. Scott, welcome back to the official Do Good Better podcast. Hey, Patrick. Thanks so much. I'm glad to be back for a second time and actually recording our ongoing conversations. So I know we should have. Well, I'm glad we didn't because I'm glad some of this is behind the veil that we don't get to actually record. So none of it can be traced back to us.
Right. The B button may have needed to be too present for some of our conversations. So
definitely. I love it. But I love having you back because I love chatting with you. You and I are kindred spirits in the nonprofit world as far as our belief goes on most things. But I'm so intrigued to talk to you today about coming out of the chaos that is 2020. Your organization experienced some of that you just couldn't even make up, as you would write a book about nonprofit hilarity in the least hilarious sort of ways. Your nonprofit experienced it. So I'm excited to talk about that sort of resiliency and what we're doing to kind of move the needle forward here in 2021. But first, if they haven't listened to episode 7, which I think you were on, why don't you tell everybody who you are, what you do at a 5,000 foot level, and start that way.
Sure. Again, as you said, Scott Burlingame, Executive Director of Independence Incorporated. We're a disability rights organization. Our mission is to, our mission isn't as important as what we do. What we do is empower people and achieve dreams. And we have been doing that for over 25 years now, all over Northwestern North Dakota. On the side, I'm pretty active in our local nonprofit agency where I'm current president of the Minot Alliance of Nonprofits. And we have, about 40 different local nonprofit members that get together and do all kinds of awesome things and trainings and stuff like that. So we've got a few different things going on, a bit of an unapologetic nonprofit nerd. Have a website out there called nonprofitthoughts.com that I sometimes write about nonprofit stuff and put other things on there that are kind of cool. So
again, we geek out at a lot of nonprofit stuff, and that's really what we love. What I love most about what you just said too, and I always pick up these wonderful quotes of yours as we have conversations, is your not dismissal, but the insistence that the mission is not as important as what we do. And just to start with this, and we'll get to chaos here in a bit, but what a wonderful statement to make, and what a wonderful idea that nonprofits should be leading with, which is your mission is just to move the board forward on where you're going to go. What is most important is the impact in what you do. Why is that? Why did you pause there? And why did you say that? Because I think that's one of the more remarkable things that's been said on the podcast as of now. And we've been 120 odd episodes in.
Look, I believe in being a mission-driven organization. I believe in paying attention to your mission. I believe in, mission integrity and things like that. But I think that those are sort of more inside baseball things. They're more things that happen, as you said, within the organization, within the board. For so many people out in the community, when you start using those terms, they tend to get a little bit lost. And so I want to be able to really kind of hit people, right between the eyes with the 2x4 on here's what we do. We remove barriers, achieve dreams. This is what we do. And almost everybody, even if you don't have a good understanding of what our long mission is, you understand what barriers are, you understand what dreams are. And you know what? All of us in life have had to remove barriers, and we've all had to achieve dreams. That is what we do. So I think it's just so important to be able to just say, this is what we do. And if you want to have conversations about how we do it, we'll have a little bit longer conversation. But we're going to start with that framework, that foundation of this is how we do things. So
a couple of the groups that you belong to, organizations that deal with a lot of nonprofits who have a lot of nonprofit members. Do you find that's a big issue in most organizations, is the lack of clarity on that, what you do and how they describe it?
Yes. And it's because we're as nature humans, complex creatures. And when we start talking about how we write grants or how we fundraise or how we put together strategic plans and all that kind of stuff, that, they can be all over the place. And they should be all over the place sometimes, because there is a time and a place for details, and details do matter. But that being said, again, that's an inside thing. And I think it's hard for us sometimes to switch that from when we go from having the conversations with our staff or with our board, or, with really key volunteers, and having conversations with the general public, with just folks, just people. And I often say, like, what is the 70-year-old lady in the grocery store? What is she going to be able to understand? And if I start talking to her about, these really complex strategic things that we do, she's not going to have any idea. And so and honestly, why don't we start with that with everybody? Even if we're going to get to that point of talking about the more strategic things, our work plan right now, the first line of our work plan is our tagline. Why is that? Because that's where it all starts. Then we get into all the different, 65 different steps of what we're going to do throughout the year and stuff like that. But it always starts with that very basic thing.
It's funny that you talk about barriers, and what an interesting barrier complexity in your explainers are for a donor. And so what sort of barriers are you as an organization, and this is for for individuals listening, look at what barriers you have that don't allow a really good and easy understanding of what you do. And if you are providing barriers of complexity, not necessarily in the complexity of your programs, which you just eloquently said, that's fine. And your board mission can be as complex as possible. But if you're not explaining in clear and simple terms, you're going to turn off a lot of people who want to make an impact, but don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time figuring out what on earth their impact is going to be. And if you're trying to figure out, you're writing War and Peace with these, appeal letters or whatever, like that's not going to get the job done, because you're now providing a very complex barrier to understanding what you do every single day.
And I think it's so important, so we work with people with disabilities, removing barriers. It's very interesting when we say that, though, because when we talk to people with disabilities, when we do our, different surveys and stuff like that, and we ask people what they think the biggest barrier is, you might think it's, well, there's a lack of wheelchair accessibility, or there's a lack of sign language interpreters, or there's a lack of assistive technology. Overwhelmingly, what we hear the biggest barrier is bureaucratic. It's the amount of things that people we put in front of people, even with the alleging to help them, that actually end up making their life worse just because of how complex they are. So even in that case, and I have that conversation about how we provide services, it's like something I really want to pound into our culture is there are times where we do have to collect certain amounts of information, but let's not collect one shred of information more than what's absolutely necessary. And even when we're having the conversations with people and inviting them to use our services, we don't have to approach them with this plethora of terms that don't really matter a whole lot. We can talk in very simplistic terms to start with, and at least create that conversation. I think that's true with donors and with grantors and everything else as well, as really being able to kind of summarize it up in a very simple, here's our value, here's why we exist. So do
you find nonprofits lean towards complexity because it makes them feel as if they are doing more, or that donors are going to be more impressed by the amount of things that we do, or the more complicated we make it, because we don't think that our simple mission is worth it to them?
Yes, I do. From time to time, I think that, first off, there's a lot of really smart, well-educated people in the nonprofit world. They come out of college, and they come out of all these different seminars and trainings and stuff like that. And so much of that is based on kind of the volume of knowledge that you're putting forward. Well, we then flip that around, because we're not writing term papers anymore. We're giving commercials. And so getting people to kind of switch from that, be able to understand that. And oftentimes we do promote people within agencies too that have a good knowledge, understanding of the big stuff, the really complex stuff. But again, being able to switch that, and it's not an either or, it's a both. We're still going to do that, but just to really kind of simplify it and really kind of pound home the key important principles are extraordinarily important. And to realize that doesn't mean you're not doing nothing, because if somebody wants more detail, you have that available. You can always dive into that. If you have a donor that comes in and is like, well, how do you remove barriers? How do you achieve? Give me some examples. Well, then I've got, hey, do you want programmatic examples? Do you want real life examples? Do you want, what do you want? I can definitely help you out with this. But that becomes the second part of the conversation, or the third or the fourth part of the conversation, not the initial conversation. So,
and that's the idea of telling your story that's interesting, that people lean in and they ask you, well, tell me more about that. Well, now you've won as a
yes.
storyteller, you've won as a solicitor, because now they're interested in taking additional time, which is as much, if not more, valuable at this juncture. They said, all right, well, I've got a little bit of time to tell me more about these things. Well, now you got the hook set. So now you slowly, I mean, if you go back to a fishing bit, because I think I'm going to try to do that this weekend, is like you just start like dragging in slowly. You want to make sure that the fight is long enough to exhaust them into going, I just need to do anything I can to do to help you. Well, that's what the storytelling piece is. And you need to lead with the simplicity so you can get to the complexity, so you can get to the close.
Right. Absolutely. 100%.
I think we're going to use a fishing terms, even though I don't know anything about that. And I don't like putting worms on hooks. Sometime we're going to have to figure that out, you and I. And speaking of complexity, I would love you to regale us with the chaos that was the year of 2020. And I think Independence has such an interesting story of holy crap, to let's get motivated, to coming out the other side and actually building more momentum with the chaos than they had prior to it. And I'd love you to regale us with the story from a budgetary standpoint, because I think the idea of resiliency coming out of 2020 and into 2021 is something that we need to hammer home for nonprofits. If you think your nonprofit has gone through challenges, sit back and pour yourself a drink and listen to Scott to regale you with a challenge that I think really is, if it was more 2020, I couldn't imagine it. All right. And if it was more of an opportunity to tell a story better, I can't think of a better organization that jumped at the chance and what you're doing right now. So I will leave the floor to you, my friend. Give us a story, please.
Well, sure. So, and ironically, as we talk about 2020, it was like we almost felt like we were getting through it, because a lot of the story happened in December of 2020,
right,
and then spilled over into the new year. and so it starts off with a couple of things. New Year or Christmas Eve, I get a call from our landlord in our former office now, and he had asked us, what was our plan? Did we want to renew our lease? And I had just went through a strategic planning with our board and had a pretty good idea what the answer was going to be, but made a few calls and quickly found out, no, that the office location that we were in wasn't working for us. We needed a better space. We needed more opportunity. And so we were like, well, we need to do that. Well, I quickly found out and kind of having conversations that if we weren't going to renew our lease, we weren't going to be able to stay there much after April 30th when our lease came up. And so we're looking at about 4 months until we have to move. So that's the first thing on Christmas Eve. And because I want to stay away from Eves, apparently, on New Year's Eve, we get an email, or I get presented with the North Dakota state budget. And our largest funding sources were funded through the North Dakota Department of Human Services Division of Local Rehab. It's our largest of our funding streams. It's about 60% of our budget. And the governor's budget comes out, and I'm looking through the governor's budget and I can't find anything about our funding. And so I start sending off emails, and I send emails to head of human services, to people in our area. I actually send emails to legislators. I'm like, where are we in here? And come to find out earlier the next week, we actually weren't in there. That administratively, the governor's office had made a mistake and forgot to fund the network of centers for independent living. So within about a week and a half, we're looking at about a 60% budget cut. And we are looking at not knowing where our office is going to be or how to pay for it, because if you have a 6% budget cut, you're not going to be moving to a new office, or we're looking at removing about 60% of our staff, and they're going to need a lot less office space for 60% less staff. So yeah, so that was the challenge we faced within a few days at the end of 2020, early 2021. So yeah, that was an experience.
Well, I mean, I know when you and I chatted about it, it was more of like a comedy of errors. Like it was just, you couldn't help it. Like, I can't understand how this would level, like on layer upon layer and layer of hilarity in the worst possible way. How do you relay that message to your board? How do you relay that message to your leadership team on the situation at hand? And what do you do to calm the waters? Because I think a lot of organizations are going to come up with some sort of disaster that's going to approach them. If they can follow your piece of advice, what did you do next?
So the first thing is, honestly, is I gathered as much information as I could before I allowed anybody to panic. I wanted to have a really good understanding of what was going to be. So I didn't, the second I found out that we weren't in the budget, I wanted to find out why. I wanted to find out what was the process for it. And I spent time talking to legislators, talking to some of the elected or the state people in the state office. I spent time talking to other center directors like mine and really trying to get an idea of what were the pure facts. Once I had those pure facts and I had a good understanding of it, I slowly began the process of kind of mobilizing the force. I reached out to my board of directors and I said, here's the deal, you guys. And even before I did that, I wanted a call to action, because I didn't want people to be like, hey, here's the end of the world. Our funding is going to soon be cut and we're going to need to prepare to shut down the office. I wanted to have something to do that. So I went through a few things. I first off made sure I told them one of the things that I talk about a lot in my nonprofit world is that we have to have the ability to absorb at least something like this. Now, we're not going to be able to absorb a 60% cut forever,
right?
But the reality is that we weren't going to start laying people off that day either. And so we had built up some strategic reserves for this purpose. And so we were able to kind of begin that process. The second thing I did was, and so I really had that call to action, which was, right now, I need you guys, I want you guys to be shocked. This is real. But I also want you to realize that here's what you need to do. And it was at that point, it was about rallying the troops. And we talk about that a lot in fundraising, about the importance of kind of building up your network and asking your network to get engaged. That I use that model, but use it in a systemic change purposes for reaching out to legislators. And so I told my board to reach out. I told them who, and I, knowing the process too, knowing what I didn't tell them, hey, go send letters to every elected official, because to be honest with you, that was a waste of effort in a lot of ways. It was about focusing in on the one committee. And they did that and they responded very well. I gave them some basic talking points. Being that I've been around legislators enough, I knew I'm not going to do a form letter because legislators hate them. I said, here's your talking points. But what I said to them was, I said, tell them why. Tell them in your own words why. Why do you think independence is of value? And so I had board members saying, I have a son with who's on the autism spectrum, and independence has been there for him. And here's the ways. And I'm asking you to please fully fund centers for independent living or to restore funding. I had, when I was going to college, I was struggling with college and I went to independence and they helped make a difference. So I graduated. Now I have a job. Or I was living in a nursing home and my life sucked. And independence came along and they helped get me set up and I lived on my own and my life was way better. It's because of this funding restored. And so we had tons and tons of people writing individual stories, but none of this happened in a vacuum. It happened because we'd been building up relationships with people for years and helping people out for years without asking anything, so that I could call in a whole bunch of favors in this point of emergency. So, and I reached out to a lot of people. And so to come around to it, come first legislative hearing on this, all of a sudden the chair of the committee, Representative Nelson out of Rugby, is asking everybody, is independent living supposed to be in this part of funding? I've heard from everybody. I'm sure I've met everybody on their board now, and we got to make sure we restore that. So because of that pressure that came in, we were in a good place almost from the very beginning, but it was organic. It came about from people who believed in our mission. So.
I love that, because I think nonprofits get caught up in, I need to be seen now all the time, every time I need to be seen now. I need to pay for this. We need to do this. Where your insistence is, for the longest time, we have been consistent in our messaging. People know who we are. We have had patience in our storytelling because we have a long-term plan. And I think when nonprofits go in with a long-term mindset of knowing that they will eventually have to cash in their chips for all the things, I don't think a lot think about it that way, because they're constantly concerned with shutting down and getting payroll, et cetera. They're constantly thinking about how they can survive rather than the long-term play. How do you manage that, knowing that budgets are always crazy and that your expenses are always crazy and that the amount of money coming in is never guaranteed? How do you mentally run through that hoop?
Well, and I think we talked about this the first time I was on your show, but a lot of it does come back to strategic planning.
Yeah.
As much as we just talked about how strategic planning is boring and we shouldn't talk about it, but we have to do it actually. And that means, maybe you do things like 50% of all of our revenue that comes in from fundraising will be set aside just for rainy day fund, for lack of a better term. And we're going to do that until we get to 3 months, 6 months, depending on what your funding streams are. And it's one of the things that on my podcast, I've had conversations with grantors and funders about is we got to stop looking at reserves as a bad thing. We got to start looking at a lack of reserves as a bad thing. If your nonprofit doesn't have reserves, you are not fiscally responsible. And as hard as that is to say, and that's a hard truth, but you will never build up that. When I started in this job, we barely had enough money to make payroll on Friday. Like I started on a Wednesday, payrolls on Friday, and we were waiting for a check to come in to make payroll. That's how real it was. I know what it's like, and it's been a 10-year process to build up a strategic reserve. But I'm glad we did that because, and we'll get into that part next about what happened with the building, but that ability to absorb the ebb and flows of funding is extraordinarily important. You have to be able to do that and
Yes.
And be unapologetic about it. And I want grantors and funders and donors to understand the importance of that as well. To not say, if you donate $20 to our company, we're going to use that 100% on here, but rather you donate $20 to our company and we're going to use it to, remove barriers and achieve dreams. I'm not going to guarantee you 100% where that money is going to go because I know more. And you and I were talking earlier about our friend Voulay from Nonprofit AF, and he talks about that all the time. Like we actually know what we're doing, and give us the credit that we understand how to run a nonprofit, and stop coming in from the outside. I don't go into Walmart and when I'm spending money at Walmart say, how are you going to invest my $1.99 that I just spent on something? Of course not. We purchase $1.99, we invest in Walmart. If I invest in the stock market, I'm not running to Apple and asking them how they're going to invest my money. When people invest in nonprofits, we have to think of it the same way. They're investing in what we do and in our mission and our integrity, not in I'm getting $20 to buy diapers for this week.
And again, it's that mindset of we need to go and so worry about a numbers thing rather than impact. Here's your impact. Your $20 is going to do this.
Yep.
Not detailed out of like a 68 cents. You're going to go to having paper and this. Nobody cares. People care when you make them care, or you can talk directly to them and say, this is going to go to the things and here's the impact we made and here's some success stories and challenges we still have. So you're 100% right with that. And I love that as a thing. And again, I love it as a long-term plan to make sure that you've got a reserves enough and to be purposeful with that. Super important. But on to buildings. So you get this thing, you're sitting in the legislature, you got to make sure that you're in. Now the building's coming up too. So we haven't had that thing talked about in a while. Where's the next part?
Well, and so and talk about like having to like live in two worlds. I had to live in like three because we're going to be able to restore the funding, or we're not going to be able to restore the funding. And then at the same time, I'm looking for a new location. And I'm looking at two different possibilities based on each of those first two outcomes. Right. And so I'm looking at if we're down to 4 staff, where can we find some really small offices and move our stuff into and sell off all of our equipment and try to survive on a very micro budget compared to what we have right now. So that's one thing going along. And in that decision, we're only going to lease an office because there's no way we could do that. But on the other side, kind of a best case scenario and trusting in yourself and believing that you're going to be able to restore this funding, be able to continue to diversify, we're looking at purchasing a building. And the reality, as I mentioned earlier, Independence has been around for 25 years. In that 25 years, they've changed office space 6 times, oftentimes out of our own control. And sometimes it's because our landlord was going to increase our rent or, things like that. And yes, we want to control our own destiny. And so we had it as part of our strategic plan to eventually buy a building, going back to, so I've been at Independence. Independence has been around 25 years. I've been here for almost 11 years. But for the first about 4 years, we didn't really do much for fundraising. We only really launched fundraising about 6 years ago. And from the very beginning, our always intention was we want to eventually purchase our own building. That was what we wanted. So it goes back 6 years worth of beginning at a snail's pace of building up fundraising. Yes. And of course, not every single dime that we brought in was going for that purpose, but it was about building capacity to fundraise so that when we actually do purchase a building, when we actually go towards building a capital campaign and stuff like that, we can do it. So we began to kind of build up towards that and looking at offices and things like that. And it was actually amazing how well things came together. And it was all contingent when we entered into an agreement to purchase the building I'm sitting in right now. It was contingent on the legislature coming through with our funding. We had to find a seller that was willing to accept that contingency and to push it out a little bit closer to the end of legislative session and all of that stuff. So, and then we just did so much work around, talking to different, to making sure we got the right interest rates and the right banks and all that kind of stuff. And using our fact as a long-term established member of the community is something that even banks wanted to invest in. And then,
yeah, the best part about this is trust the process you've already enacted and have been enacting for a long period of time. And that means you have people understand on your board what your mission is, what your long-term plans in, what your goals are, so that when you ask them to contact representatives and senators, they know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly their asks. They know exactly how passionate that they need to be. The process. That's number one. And then number two is that you're talking about capacity in a sense that's more than just the capacity to raise money. It's the capacity to have a plan and execute it. And that's an incredible thing that I think a lot of organizations lack, is that their capacity building is not necessarily a game plan for more than how can I fill this room full of this particular event. It's not what any of that means. Your capacity to run as an organization has a number of different layers. And that part of that is that process and that long-term 6 years of planning that finally comes to fruition.
well, it's interesting too, because something I was just talking about, I have just hired a new community relations person. We were having this conversation yesterday about, I don't even know how it triggered it, but I thought about you at one point, and I think you had said, people don't invest in the agency, they invest in the director. But there's a certain amount of even myself, as an executive director, being intentional with having a community presence. Because if nobody's ever heard of independence and nobody's ever heard of me, what are the chances they're going to invest in our company? So even being intentional with, I'm not going to sit in my desk all the time and fill out boring paperwork, that I'm actually going to get out there and show up at things and be part of our community, even when there's no immediate inline. I'm going to show up at community events. I'm engaged in our local chamber of commerce. I want to be part of this community, because it's the right thing to do, because it's an awesome community, but also because those are the chips that I cashed in when I needed it for both the new building and for restoring our funding. Nobody's
going to know how passionate you are from sitting behind and writing a couple of emails and posting on social media. They are going to meet you and they are going to ask you what you do. And you are going to talk about enthusiastically because you buy in 100% on what independence does in the first place. And they're going to tell others hey, have you met Scott? That dude is all in on, breaking down barriers and giving access to individuals. You should meet that guy. And that endorsement is worth way more than hey, I'm going to email you to talk to no. They're talking about you. They're talking about how passionate you are. They're talking about meeting you. They're talking about that is so unbelievably needed. And if you are an executive director or you are a fundraiser or you're just a volunteer or a board member getting out into the community, COVID,
made it much harder.
Damper into it. But that's because you take a lot of time. You've been out there for years. You've been having social capital for years. And I think a lot of our attention span is if we don't see action right away, if we don't see results right away, we're failures and we got to change tactics. No, your consistency is what made that happen. Your consistency is what aligned all those stars, and your consistency is what you're going to use going forward to make sure that you're serving as many people as possible.
I think about a time about 6 years ago, 4 years ago, and I sat down and I made up a list of 50 people that I wanted to get to know. And I contacted them and I asked them to go out for coffee. And it took, probably a year. And that's all. I had no other expectation than I wanted to get to know them. And so that, and some of them I've developed great relationships, some I haven't talked to since.
Yeah, right.
But I invested, I was intentional in saying, these are interesting people I want to get to know. And having that natural curiosity has always been, it's one of my most important traits. It's why I'm sitting in the job I am. It's why I do it. I like to have interesting conversations. So I can just switch it around. I'm going to have coffee with somebody and have an interesting conversation. That's my only outcome I'm looking for. I'm not even thinking about, can this person, and in fact, they can see through that sometimes.
Yeah.
If I'm just there snoozing them up because I'm going to ask them for money later on, they're going to see through that a million miles away. And you know what? Even if I do end up asking them for money and they say no, I still invite them out for coffee the next time, because whatever, or if I ask them to volunteer and they say no or whatever, I don't care.
Their Rolodex in there, and their thoughts about you as you making a difference mean way more than a check at the end of the day.
Right.
And I think the power of not asking anybody for money and the power of having conversations with people who you find genuinely interesting will pay off exponentially more than just doing it because you need to raise funds. And the surprise on people's faces when they're like, well, what do you want? Nothing. I literally wanted to get a hold of you and just chat. One of the best examples of that, and I got to connect with Delray Williams, who's the former mayor of Moorhead, who I find just to be fascinating. She's a fascinating character. And I asked her for coffee as somebody who owns a business. And I said, Delray, I just really want to ask you out and just get to know you better. And she's like, well, why? I go, because I find you interesting. And she said that she's like one of the first people that's ever asked me that didn't ask for something. And I go, isn't it? And that you get to be known as the person who didn't ask for anything. And how cool is that? And that becomes a story they tell of or their expectations or of others to not be so asking. Like, I'm curious. Back in the day where I want to get to know you. I want to talk with you. I want to be and learn from you or whatever. Like, that's it.
Yeah. I have a friend of mine from California who thinks all I do in Minot, and of course this was thrown off by COVID, but all I do is go out to coffee with people.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to accept that. I know the coffee places well here in town. I have specials at almost every one of them. And I enjoy doing that. And it feeds my soul a little bit. So I really appreciate it. And
yeah, I love that.
I miss doing it now that we're, back to normal a little bit more. I'm enjoying doing it again.
That's that I think is the ultimate fundraising expertise in the back pocket, is like the art of conversation that is not soliciting, but it's asking better questions. It's just being around, it's being curious, and just being an interested party in a conversation differentiates yourself so much from everybody else who has some sort of agenda at the end of their conversation. Because I know you've been in a conversation with somebody that you go an hour long into a conversation, and as you're getting your keys ready and you're, hey, can I ask you something? You're like, whoa, wait a second. You had an hour to pitch me on this thing and you suckered me right in. And then it becomes almost like gross.
Yep. I think back to a few years ago, I had two different people reach out to me in the same week. And both of them were people I thought, hey, I haven't heard from this person, but I'd love to talk. And both of them ended up trying to convince me to join some multi-tier marketing thing. And I'm like, no, I don't want to join your multi-tier marketing thing, but I'm really glad you reached out to me only for this. It's like, no, like people will be part of people want to be part of something. And so all I try to sell is what independence is doing and how we're making a difference for people in our community.
Yep.
And I want people to be part of that. And sometimes it's by joining a committee, sometimes it's by volunteering, sometimes it's by joining our board or by donating. And I appreciate each of those equally. And yeah, we do good things that way. And it's how we affect change. And it's how we saved our company. I mean, just to be blunt, it's how we saved our company and moved into a building that is right now being remodeled to meet our needs for the future. We're launching a capital campaign. I haven't even officially announced it publicly yet, but we're officially announcing it in an event in September. Doing all kinds of fun stuff with that because we want to pay off our building, retire our debt, and be able to spend everything on providing good quality services. So
patience, being authentically interested in others, and just knowing that there's a long game, regardless of whatever adversity is thrown at you, like the governor forgetting part of your budget, or I don't know, like your building going away. Like that's the type of resiliency, and that's the type of solutions that you need to some adversity, is that resiliency of knowing that you got a long game and knowing it's going to be okay. And again, this is why I just love talking to you in the first place, is because you and I are kindred spirits in this whole thing. And I just appreciate your time today, being back as a guest of the official Do Good Better podcast. Scott, how can people get a hold of you? They're interested in learning about independence. They're looking, hey, they want to give you a bunch of money because they love what you do, because, you know, you're breaking down barriers. How do they get a hold of you? How do they connect? And how do they pay attention and follow what you are doing up in Minot?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples here. First off, of course, our website is independencecil.org. We just the other thing we did in 2020 during all our COVID was we rebranded, came out with a brand new logo, brand new color scheme, did all of that because that was something that was easy to do when we weren't in office quite as much. But again, another example, we brought in community members, people I had coffee with, came in and volunteered their time to help us out with this. And so I'm very proud of the new website. That's always a good place to start. The other thing I would really recommend too is, as I mentioned earlier, with the Alliance of Nonprofits of Minot, we have a podcast also. We're actually doing a year-long conversation around the fragility of nonprofits. If COVID taught us anything, is that some nonprofits are in tough shape. And so we're blessed to get a Bush Community Innovation Grant to fund this year-long podcast, where we're having 26 different conversations about nonprofit fragility, bringing in tons of different people and talking about that. So that's available, the Nonprofit Talk, any place people consume podcasts, available on Alliance of Nonprofits Facebook page, Minot Alliance of Nonprofits Facebook page. Definitely welcome to do that. Independence's Facebook page, social media, any of those places are definitely ways to reach out to and check out what Independence does, and also what the Alliance of Nonprofits and the Nonprofit Talk is all about. So
we will put all of those links in the show notes, and I would suggest that you go and check out that podcast, which we will also link there as well. So after you're done with this, go listen to Scott and his brilliant mind, because it's some of the more interesting conversations that he has, a great deal of hilarity and sadness all wrapped up in a wonderful podcast there. I love it. Go listen to that. Scott, thank you so much, but not only for your time, but for what you do. And your ability to share and your perspective with the nonprofit community is priceless. And you're the best. Absolutely. Thanks for being a guest on the official Do Good Better podcast.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it all.